The ocean was calm, too calm. American carriers cut through the Pacific in silence, their decks tense with anticipation. No enemy in sight, no confirmation. Only fragments of intelligence and a growing sense that something massive was coming. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet was moving, but no one knew exactly where, or when the first blow would fall. This was the most dangerous kind of waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood that silence could be deceptive. It could mean safety, or it could mean disaster approaching at full speed. He had reports, intercepted messages, patterns that suggested Midway was the target, but nothing was complete. Nothing was guaranteed. If he was wrong, his carriers would sail straight into destruction. If he waited for certainty, it would already be too late. On the flight decks, pilots checked their planes again and again, not because something was wrong, but because their hands needed something to do. They knew the odds. They knew the Japanese carrier force was larger, more experienced, and deadly precise. Everyone felt it. This was not going to be a clean fight. Below deck, maps were studied in silence. Officers whispered. Calculations were made, erased, then made again. Midway was more than an island. It was a test of intelligence, of nerve, of leadership under uncertainty. Nimitz stood at the center of it all, carrying a decision that could not be undone. He could spread his forces and play it safe, or he could concentrate them, trusting imperfect information and instinct. The Pacific waited, and within hours, that silence would break in ways no one fully expected. Chester Nimitz did not have the luxury of certainty. The intelligence on his desk was incomplete. Fragments of intercepted Japanese messages, educated guesses, patterns that suggested intent, but not precision. What he knew was simple. Midway was the bait, and the Japanese were coming. What he did not know was the exact timing, or the exact approach. Most commanders would have waited, asked for more confirmation, played defense. Nimitz did the opposite. He placed his carriers northeast of Midway, out of sight, out of expected position. It was a calculated gamble. If the intelligence was wrong, the Japanese fleet would strike Midway and then hunt down the American carriers one by one. If the timing was off, American planes would launch too early or too late, missing their chance entirely. There would be no second attempt. This decision concentrated nearly all remaining American carrier strength into one trap. There was no reserve, no backup plan. Lose here, and the Pacific would belong to Japan. Officers questioned the risk. Quietly, privately, Nimitz listened, then made his choice. He trusted his codebreakers. He trusted the pattern of Japanese thinking. And he trusted that surprise could still matter. Out at sea, the carriers held position. Engines ready. Aircraft fueled. Waiting. Every minute stretched longer than the last. Somewhere, Japanese carriers were preparing their strike. But neither side could see the other. Two forces racing toward a collision, guided by decisions made in rooms far from the battlefield. The gamble was set. Now the war would decide whether Nimitz had read the moment correctly. At dawn, the Japanese strike began. Aircraft lifted from their carriers and headed toward Midway. Their mission was clear. Cripple the island. Clear the way for invasion. The attack was powerful, but it was not decisive. Midway was damaged, not destroyed. That single detail changed everything. Reports reached the Japanese flagship quickly. The island was still operational. Another strike would be needed. And that is where time became the enemy. On the flight decks, Japanese crews began a frantic process. Aircraft that had been armed for anti-ship attacks were now reconfigured for another strike on land. Bombs were swapped. Torpedoes were moved aside. Fuel lines were disconnected and reconnected. It was slow, and it was dangerous. Planes sat crowded on the decks and hangars, fully fueled, weapons stacked nearby. The fleet was in transition. Then new reports arrived. American ships had been spotted. Now the orders changed again. Rearm the planes. This time for ships, the process reversed. More movement, more confusion. What the Japanese commanders did not realize was how narrow the window had become. Their carriers were exposed, decks cluttered, defenses disorganized. They believed they still had time. They were wrong. Because while they rushed to prepare the perfect strike, American planes were already in the air, disorganized, under-equipped, and heading straight into disaster. The first American planes arrived in pieces, not as a coordinated wave, not with precision. They came in scattered groups, at different altitudes, from different directions. And they were met by a wall of fire. Japanese fighters tore into them almost immediately. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts. American torpedo bombers flew low and slow, perfect targets. One squadron after another was cut down. Planes vanished into the ocean. Crews never had a chance to release their weapons. From the Japanese decks, it looked like victory was unfolding exactly as planned. The American attacks were failing, badly. But those failed attacks had an effect no one fully understood at the time. Japanese fighters were pulled low, chasing torpedo planes near the water. Their attention focused downward. Their fuel burned away. Above them, the sky was suddenly empty. The American dive bombers were late, off course, running low on fuel. Some pilots believed they had missed the enemy entirely. Then, almost by accident, they found them. Below, the Japanese carriers were turning into the wind. Decks crowded, aircraft packed tight. For a brief moment, everything aligned. Altitude, position, timing. A window had opened, and it would not stay open for long. The dive bombers rolled over almost at the same time. From high above, the Japanese carriers finally came into view. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Below them, the decks were chaos. Planes fueled. Bombs exposed. Crews running in every direction. They were completely unprepared for what was about to happen. American pilots pushed their noses down and dove straight into fire. Anti-aircraft guns reacted too late. Fighters were too low to intercept. For the Japanese fleet, this was the worst possible moment. Bombs fell. One struck near the center of a flight deck. Another tore through parked aircraft. Explosions chained together, feeding on fuel and ammunition. Fire spread instantly. In minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning out of control. What had been the most powerful carrier force in the world was suddenly crippled. Commanders shouted orders that no longer mattered. Damage control teams fought fires they could not contain. 6 minutes. That was all it took. 6 minutes turned confidence into shock. 6 minutes erased years of Japanese naval superiority. 6 minutes rewrote the balance of the war in the Pacific. A 4th carrier would fall later that day, but the outcome was already sealed. The gamble had paid off, not because everything went according to plan, but because chance, timing, and pressure collided at exactly the wrong moment for Japan. The smoke could be seen for miles. Burning Japanese carriers drifted across the sea, their flight decks destroyed, their air groups gone. What had taken years to build was lost in a single day. For Japan, the shock was immediate. Experienced pilots were dead. Carriers that could never be replaced were sinking. For the United States, the reality took longer to sink in. Midway was not a perfect victory. American losses were heavy. Planes were destroyed. Crews were missing. But the balance had changed. Japan would never again fight from a position of unquestioned superiority. From this point forward, it would be reacting, not dictating. And it all traced back to a decision made under uncertainty. Nimitz had trusted incomplete intelligence. He had concentrated his forces instead of playing safe. He had accepted that risk was unavoidable. The battle was not won by flawless execution. It was won because pressure exposed mistakes. The Japanese delay, the failed American attacks, the sudden opening in the sky, all of it converged in one irreversible moment. Midway did not end the war, but it ended the illusion that Japan could not be stopped. Victory came at a price, and the men who paid it never knew how close the outcome had been to going the other way. History remembers the triumph, but it was shaped by hesitation, risk, and 6 minutes where the future of the Pacific hung in the air.